So hello. So in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about direct funding for the arts and arts councils. Okay, so in last week's video, we talked about what actually amounts to the main form of support for the arts in the United States, which is indirect supports, all the subsidies we give to charitable donations to the arts. And now we're going to talk about direct support. And so in the US, this refers to, at the federal government level, the National Endowment for the Arts. It also refers to all the state government arts agencies like the Indiana Arts Commission, with its headquarters in Indianapolis. And it actually goes all the way down to local arts councils as well. And in fact, what we see in the US, because it's a federal system, is while the National Endowment for the Arts does give some direct grants to arts organizations, it also gives a lot of money to the state arts organizations. And the state arts organizations give money to some arts presenters, and they also give money to local arts organizations to then distribute, okay? In the US, this makes a lot of sense because it's a very big country. It has very diverse cultural interests, and it would be hard for a single agency in Washington, DC to, effectively know best about what kind of art support is best suited for, Idaho or Arizona or Indiana or Maine. It makes a lot of sense to decentralize this. I'll give a warning that sometimes you will see statistics on arts funding from different countries, and they will compare things like, French government spending, German government spending to the budget of the National Endowment for the Arts, but recognize that the National Endowment for the Arts is only a small part of government direct support of the arts in the United States. Okay. So how does this work? Well, what do these arts organizations do? Like, what do the National Endowment for the Arts, or in Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts, and all the different provincial arts boards, like the Saskatchewan Arts Board, where I've included a link on the syllabus there, Australian Arts Council, New Zealand Arts Council, Scotland, England, all these places. How do they actually work? Well, what they do is these are organizations that in effect don't really make arts policy as such. Okay, and it's a mistake to see them as sort of a policy making agency within government in the same way that, say, a Department of Transportation might be making policy, or a Department of Natural Resources. These are grant-making agencies. Essentially, their big job is to give out money to arts presenters to do things, okay? And so as such, they don't really have a role in policy. So if we think of different kinds of policy issues that affect the arts, say in the United States, whether it's international trade policy, copyright, freedom of expression, telecommunications policy, technology, and so on, the National Endowment for the Arts has nothing to do with any of those areas, okay? And it is not its job to do so. It stays fairly quiet when these things are being debated. It acts as an advocate for the arts. If you follow the National Endowment for the Arts on Twitter, for example, you'll see lots of tweets about, wonderful artists and wonderful arts organizations and people doing good things, but you won't see it advocate for particular policy positions, except for the single one that the arts are good, right? That's about it, okay? So don't think of these arts organizations as, this is where policy is actually made. It for a large degree, it really isn't. Now, you could say, well, there is some policy in terms of they're deciding what kinds of grants to give, for what kinds of things to give money, and sure, okay? But, that's about it. That's about the extent of it. Okay, so that's the first thing to notice here. What's the second thing to notice? Second thing to notice is that essentially, for the most part, these arts councils are meant to support the nonprofit arts, not the commercial sector, okay? So to receive a grant from the Indiana Arts Commission, to receive a grant from the Saskatchewan Arts Board, you have to be a nonprofit, okay? You cannot be a commercial business. And so, here in Bloomington, the Buskirk Chumley Theater, because it's operated as a nonprofit, it can apply for these kinds of grants. The Bluebird, which is a commercial venue, cannot, okay? Even if sometimes they have similar kinds of traveling artists and so on, okay? So it's for nonprofits. Why is that, okay? Why do we do that? Because after all, you know, commercial arts organizations do good things, right? We want commercial art galleries to show new artists' work, commercial venues that host, you know, traveling musicians and so on. That's all great. So why not do that? Well, here's the issue. For grad students, we explore this in a bit more detail in Y 504 next semester. But the essence of a nonprofit organization is that sort of the core idea of a nonprofit organization is that any revenue it receives has to be used in its actual programming. No net revenues can be pocketed by any owners because essentially there are no owners, but rather any revenues received either have to be saved for a future use or spent now on actual programming, okay? Commercial organizations, if they take in extra revenue, well, that's profit for the owners, right? They can pocket it. That's their income. So when it comes to giving a grant, if the government gives a grant to a for-profit entity, even if it's a very admirable for-profit entity, I buy lots of books from Penguin publishers, right? And it's meant a great deal to me in terms of the arts, but it is a commercial entity. If the government gives grants to a commercial entity like that, it's just more profit for them. It doesn't mean there's going to be more extensive programming. It doesn't mean they're going to be actually doing anything special with that money. It's just more profit. So why would the government actually do that, right? I'm going to make an exception for COVID times, okay? Because during the coronavirus, there actually might be a rationale for giving some money to commercial organizations, namely, we will give you money to pay your employees and tide you over until things can open up again. So we'll treat that later in the course. But in ordinary times, government won't do this. A nonprofit, if you give it a grant, you know that it is actually going to spend it on actual programs that it's supposed to do, right? And so the government has sort of more confidence in granting money that that's where the money is going to go, okay? Looking back to last week when we talked about indirect support of the arts, one thing to keep in mind is that you only get a tax break for giving money to the arts if it's to a registered nonprofit, okay? That's the only way it works. On the other hand, we would never charitably give money to a for-profit organization anyway. I mean, why would we? We wouldn't know where the money is going. I like buying Penguin books, but there's no reason for me to send them $100 check just saying, hey, good job, you guys. Because that's just more profit for them. Why would I do that? But I will give money to a nonprofit organization because I'll think, this is actually going to go into programming, okay? So we give donations to nonprofits. It's nonprofits that get that tax break for charitable donations, and public arts councils, they give the money to nonprofits and individual artists as well. Did I say individual artists? Well, that actually depends. It depends on the arts council. Some public arts councils give grants to individual artists and some don't. The National Endowment for the Arts, for the most part, doesn't. It used to. When it was first formed, it would give money to budding novelists and painters and performers. It ended up being kind of problematic because people got to be worried about, well, what are these artists actually going to do? Sometimes they would do fairly controversial work. And so the National Endowment for the Arts, except for some writers' grants, has pretty much shut down programs. If you're an aspiring painter, you can't really look to the National Endowment for the Arts for support. It's not going to give it. It gives money to arts organizations. If you're an aspiring painter in Saskatchewan, on the other hand, if you look at their website, you'll see that, yeah, actually artists can get small grants, and it's going to be very small. They're not going to support you so that you can rest easy, but they will give small grants to individual artists to sort of help them along. Okay, so that's what these organizations actually do. So if you look at the National Endowment for the Art website and just look at their, what they give money for, you can get a sense of, okay, this is the kind of thing they fund. All right. Where do these come from? Well, the article by Anna Upchurch. It's sort of the one scholarly article I've got on this week. I encourage you to read because it gives a good sense of sort of why do sort of Anglo-American countries use this Arts Council model. And that article talks about John Maynard Keynes, who is the very famous economist, the sort of founder of what we now universally know as Keynesian economics, where Keynesian economics means that government ought to play a role in helping to stabilize business cycles. Government ought to increase spending and stimulate the economy if it's going into a recession, and it can subsequently scale back when the economy is booming. That's sort of the essence of what we know of as Keynesian economics. He was a very prolific writer. But he was also very much somebody who liked to hang around with artists, and the Bloomsbury circle that he was with, including the famous novelist Virginia Woolf and her husband Leonard, novelist E.M. Forster, Clive and Vanessa Bell, Clive Bell being an art writer and critic, Vanessa Bell being a painter. In fact, one of Vanessa Bell's paintings is actually right on this course website, the picture of the Bloomsbury group that you see at the top of the syllabus. There's Keynes in the middle, all slouched out, and all of his fellow artist circle there, all discussing matters of great importance. So she talks about Bloomsbury and sort of their attitude towards things. And two things really come out of it. And I'm not going to belabor the point. You can read it on your own to a large degree. But importantly, they said two things. One is that there ought to be support of independent artists and arts organizations, that we should not just leave it to private commercial markets, that it would force artists, and theater companies, and museums to try to tailor themselves to whatever was going to earn enough money to succeed, and that there's a role for the government in trying to foster the arts so that people can be independent, they can be inventive, they can try new things. Remember, the Bloomsbury group was all about experimentation in painting. They brought to England the first exhibition of the post-impressionists in painting. Virginia Woolf, extremely innovative novelist and author who really reshaped a lot of 20th century literature. They thought this kind of invention was really, really important, and that you needed some kind of support for that to happen, because commercially it was not really going to do. Okay, so that's one part of it. Okay, that's one part of it, this need for support, and especially support for the innovative and the new. The second thing they had was a real distrust, essentially, of the formal apparatus of the government. They thought that, if you just sort of put this kind of support for the arts within the government bureaucracy, it wouldn't fund any innovation at all. Everything would be funding sort of the tried and true, the mediocre, as they called it, whatever's going to have the most support from voters, but essentially it would be dull, and it would be conformist, and would not really serve the purpose that they saw as what you really wanted to foster in the arts. And so their big idea, and Keynes's great idea, and this is hugely influential, because even though this is an English circle, essentially the National Endowment for the Arts, the Canada Council for the Arts, Australia, all these countries drew from this. Okay, so the American system comes from this. You got to keep that in mind. They said, okay, let's set up something that is so-called arm's length. Okay, and this is the phrase you see all the time, arm's length. Namely, it is a government-funded agency. It ultimately has to report to the government. It's not entirely on its own. The head of the National Endowment for the Arts still has to report, if asked, to Congress, is still a part of the Department of the Interior, but it is outside of that formal bureaucracy, okay? Even though it's a state government agency, all right? It sits outside of the formal government departments and is left with a lot of decision-making powers on its own. So Congress, Washington, approves a budget for the National Endowment for the Arts, but it does not tell the National Endowment for the Arts, here are the symphonies and the museums and the theater companies that we want you to give money to, okay? The National Endowment for the Arts decides that on its own. It does it through inviting people to apply for grants, okay? And what I put on the syllabus was, where you can do that. You apply for grants. It goes through peer review panels, so people who actually work in the sector, including artists, but also lay people. They evaluate the grant proposals, they make recommendations, it goes further up the chain, and ultimately a grant is approved. But there's no government bureaucracy that's doing it. It's all within the agency, okay? So it is non-politicized. It is non-politicized. The representative from whatever state's 8th district doesn't get to say, National Endowment for the Arts, I want you to give money to this museum. Okay, they don't do that. So it's independent that way. And that was Keynes's big innovation, what became the Arts Council England, okay? So he worked essentially for decades trying to figure out how to do things. When the Second World War came and it became obvious that organizations were going to need some kind of support, he started in the middle of the Second World War looking for ways to get funding to different arts institutions in the United Kingdom to try to maintain it during a crisis. It's interesting that we're in a crisis now and we're looking at, what kind of funds can sustain things. If you look at the Creative Scotland website, you'll see they have all kinds of programs for getting us through the coronavirus. But the Arts Council England came out of crisis as well. It came out of the Second World War. They had genuine fears in the early 1940s that it was not going to turn out the way we know it did. There were genuine fears that the Nazis might be victorious over all of Western Europe. There were genuine fears that if the Nazis were not victorious, it would be because Stalin's Soviet Union defeated them and they would end up controlling things. So there was this real worry about, very authoritarian states coming into being, and that you had to preserve the arts in the face of this genuine, huge threat. And remember, they did not know how the war was going to turn out, okay? So this was the idea. Set up an arm's length arts council outside of the bureaucracy that would both, provide the arts for the public in this time of crisis, but also would be the kind of agency that could be innovative, support new artists, and arts organizations who were trying to do innovative things. It's a good system. I like it. Okay, I like it. It allows for diversity in arts funding. Doesn't operate perfectly, and we can quibble with how the National Endowment for the Arts or the Indiana Arts Commission decides on what kind of organizations get what kind of money. Sure, but I've got to say, as a design for a system, it is hard to think of something that would be an improvement, either just leaving it entirely to the market or placing everything inside sort of giant government departments and bureaucracies. So that's how arts councils work. Thanks.